Wow, with intro music like that, how couldn't you be excited for our day 3 episode? Today we're going to go through war on the home front, and we're also going to take a look at the effects on society. There will be another open-ended question at the end of this one. So here we go. All right, mobilizing the economy. Once we're into World War II, we have to shift all of our production, I shouldn't say all, but the vast majority of our production towards the war effort. The War Production Board was created. If you remember, we talked about that in World War I, but it never really got going because we were in the war for such a short amount of time. In this case, not the same. By 1944, war production doubled that of all of the Axis powers combined. A lot of historians think the United States won World War II because we could simply outproduce everybody. The idea of a cost plus basis, what we're going to see is throughout the course of this industrial production that's going on, the government is going to be taking steps to minimize the impact of the economy on the average American citizen. So there'll be price setting that will take place, anti-inflation and things like that. And so really this was a full force effort into pushing for making war materials. The results of this, number one, it ends the Depression, right? Our essay question or discussion question that we worked at before was, were the New Deal programs going to work? And the bottom line is we don't know for sure. Were they trending that way? Yes and no, kind of up and down. Had some success and then had a recession again, then had a little success. Most likely, over a certain length of time, probably would have fixed itself, or the New Deal programs would have helped us out. But it doesn't matter because once World War II hits, the Depression is over. We're also going to see the consolidation of industry. Things are going to be switched over for the war effort and kind of lumped together in a huge process. Some of the effects of the war spending, you'll see our gross national product is going to go through the roof from roughly $100 billion to over $310 billion by 1945. And of course, unemployment is going to drop dramatically. 1940, we had close to 8 million Americans unemployed. By 1944, it's barely any. You see it go up a little bit in 45 as the war is starting to wind down, and we have soldiers coming home after the war ends and their enlistment is done. So that has a little bit of an effect on unemployment. All right, as we're mobilizing the economy, there's another aspect to it, and that's what's happening to the civilian population. And so there's rationing and price controls, which I had alluded to a little bit earlier. There's actually an organization set up known as the Office of Price Administration. And again, they're trying to keep inflation from taking place, so they keep prices set at the same amount. That helps people because there aren't going to be a lot of raises during the war because, again, everything is kind of geared towards war production and more effort. People will make more money because they're going to be working more hours. You can work pretty much so as many hours as you can put in, because most factories were running around the clock. Rationing will take place. You see an example of a rationing card. This was handed out to most American families. In this case here, the one on the bottom is a fuel oil ration. And if you didn't have a stamp, you could not purchase, no matter how much money you had, that item. In this case, it's fuel oil ration. So the stamps that were there, you'd have to turn the stamp in, and that's what you got. If you used it all up, you couldn't get any more. This was a way that the government had to try to keep pushing materials towards the war effort and limit the consumption of the American society. And like I said, we had an anti-inflation act, again, trying to keep prices set the same. Controlling labor, Most unions took no strike pledges, said they're going to work no matter what. Again, they were attempting to save the free world, so to speak. So this was something everybody thought was their part. Everybody was kind of on board. The entire country, for the most part, was really behind the war effort. There will be some unrest in a couple of cities. Most of it revolves around race relations. On the West Coast, it's relations with Latino Americans, and then in Chicago and a little bit on the East Coast, there's some issues in these industrialized areas with African Americans as well. The Smith-Conley Anti-Strike Act and the War Labor Disputes Acts. So these were government programs essentially that were put in to prevent strikes. Personal income is going to increase. Again, not necessarily because wages are going up, but because people are working so many more hours, and we have dual family incomes. So women are being mobilized and working in the workforce. In some cases, men are working as well, obviously, or else they're in the military. Either way, they're getting paid. So overall, personal and family income generally is increasing. Farmers are doing well because, again, we have people that need the food all around the world. And so the United States becomes the major producer. Union membership will increase as well. You can see the graph down on the bottom that the unions are going to, skyrocket during this time. Again, it's kind of a sense of belonging. Even though there is no strikes or anything like that, it's just people feel like they're a part of something. So we see a huge increase. Farmers, like I said, I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. Farm income doubled as it did in World War I. Again, we're once again producing for the whole world. So that's kind of obvious. This time we have better farming practices, so we're not going to see as big of a recession in farming post-World War II like we did in World War I. So we do a little bit better job of taking care of the land, and also we become, I would say, a lot more involved in the global market after this in the agricultural world. So we are able to keep up, as World War I was a dramatic drop after the war. World War II, we don't see that. Financing the war, $321 billion total. Costs $100 billion for 1945 alone. Obviously, that's very expensive. We had Income Tax Revenue Act of 1942, everyone withholding. Still, income tax is not enough to pay for the war, so we sell Liberty bonds. The Liberty bonds essentially was something that people could buy, and it's like a savings account, but you're lending the U.S. government money, and you buy that bond, and it will mature in X number of years, so maybe 5 years. So you give the government $200, and 5 years later they give you $210. So they're going to pay you a little bit of interest. So there was huge bond drives, and almost every country does this because you can't just simply print out more money to pay for the war. When you do that, you create massive inflation, and it really lowers the value of your money. Tons of propaganda, and we've seen these many times before. We have the Office of War Information. We kind of avoided the anti-German hysteria of World War I, but there was tremendous anti-Japanese hysteria on the West Coast, and a lot of that was due to the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and then the concept of the Japanese were sneaky, they weren't honest, and that's going to kind of play off in the propaganda, and as a result, we're going to see a large-scale rounding up, literally, of Japanese Americans and being relocated to camps. So you can see a couple of propaganda posters down there. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, trying to get people to conserve gas and ride share. Canning food, of course I can. Again, saving the food that's being produced in the fields for the war effort. And then the one on the right there, get a war job, encouraging women to get out and do their part to help with the war. The star you see in the background signals that she had a husband serving in the war effort. And of course, we're trying to be, anti-Nazi. We're preventing, or we're fighting to prevent this, the Nazis crushing our churches. And one of my favorites there on the right, loose talk can cost lives. Adolf Hitler there with the big ears listening to a soldier who was talking about maybe what he did or where he went to a gal. All right, some of the effects on society. Obviously, it ended the Depression. We had high employment. If you wanted a job, you definitely could get one. Farm crisis ended. Again, we're producing, for the world. The two graphs, by the way, you see on the right are just duplicates of what we talked about before. Personal income is going to increase because people are working more hours. Rationing is taking place. You can't even spend all the money that you have. Therefore, savings will increase. We see union membership increase and corporate consolidation. So kind of repeating some of the things that we saw before. All right, urbanization is going to increase. People are going to move into urban areas, especially industrial urban areas. And we're going to see some industrialization take place on the West Coast too. And so that's the migration to the West, especially California. We had rapid industrialization of those Western states. Again, California is kind of the example that we use there. Henry J. Kaiser and Kaiser Steel, that was kind of considered the catalyst for the industrialization of the West Coast. That's where Kaiser Steel was based. They create factories out there and really centered around shipbuilding. And so most shipbuilding had been done on the East Coast for years. And now we're going to see it on the West Coast taking place. And also see a huge increase in military posts and defense installations. The vast majority of those are in the South. So if you look at that map there on the right, it's kind of a ring, if you will, along the coast and in the South. Not a lot of military installations in the Midwest. Women, work, and family. In the armed forces, there were over 200,000 women that were served. They were served in non-combat roles. At that time, they could not be involved in combat. So those could be clerical jobs. They could be secretaries, nurses, logistics specialists, and in some cases, even pilots. They would fly planes to duty stations after they were produced, but they would not be flying them into combat. We see about 6.5 million women entering the workforce, which was a 57% increase, concentrated in government and clerical jobs again. And poster we see on the bottom right there is the famous Rosie the Riveter. We can do it. And we see the picture there in the middle, a woman working in the factory. There is a little bit of a downside to this. We had what we called 8-hour orphans. There was an increase in juvenile delinquency and petty crime. Surveys of the time showed a real concern that families were negatively impacted by the war because they didn't have a parent at home. And so there's the creation of some government daycare centers. But it's definitely going to be an issue, but before it gets to be too big of an issue, the war is going to end. So the war really lasts from 1942 to 1945. Because December 7th is only a few days before 1942. All right, so impact on society with minorities and rights. We're going to see a second Great Migration, first one being with World War I. So again, we're going to see African Americans moving out of the South into the industrial regions, or the Rust Belt, sometimes referred to. So think of Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Ohio, places like that where there's a lot of industry. And then obviously some of that's going to take place on the West Coast too. Race riots did break out in Detroit and New York. And it's not listed on here, but there's also a racially charged riot that takes place in the West Coast too. That was sometimes known as the Zoot Suit Riot, and that was between Hispanic Americans and whites that took place along the Kaiser Steel and the the shipbuilding areas there where there was some tension that existed. In the armed forces, over 1 million served in segregated units. So still the law of the land at the time was segregation. And so African Americans served in all African American units. Japanese Americans will serve as well in all Japanese American units. Efforts to end discrimination. Black unions threatened marches. A. Philip Randolph threatened a march on Washington in 1942. Put pressure on companies with government contracts to make sure that they were hiring minorities. And then we're going to see something known as the Double V campaign, which was victory over dictators abroad and over racism at home. And when we talk about the civil rights movement, we're really going to kind of point back to this time as probably the beginning of the civil rights movement. FDR's response to all of this was the executive order prohibiting discrimination in defense plants. So defense plants, which was most plants at this time, had to hire minorities. And Fair Employment Practices Commission to investigate any discrimination that came up. The results we see over there on the left is a significant decrease in the number of minorities willing to accept the status of second class citizens, and the repudiation of Nazi racism strengthened civil rights efforts here. So the Nazis were clearly following a racist policy of the annihilation of Jews. And so we said that was not good. And African Americans pointed out that racist policies towards any minority was not good. Here's an example of some of the segregated units, just pictures here. The top one is probably the most famous, which is the Tuskegee Airmen, which is a group of pilots. They trained at the Tuskegee Institute, and that's how they got the nickname the Tuskegee Airmen. All right, Japanese Americans. I told you before that they were basically rounded up in that area that you see on the map there that's kind of pink. It's known as the military area or exclusion zone. Any Japanese Americans that lived in that area were forced to abandon their homes and their businesses and relocate to those camps that you see, the little black boxes there on the right. And that was under Executive Order 9066. And as you could imagine, it is going to be challenged in the court system. And Korematsu versus the United States, which is a Supreme Court case, the United States Supreme Court ruled that it was a military necessity to move, to move Japanese Americans out of their homes. Most of these people, by the way, had never ever been to Japan. They had been Americans their whole lives, and put them in these camps, which literally were in the middle of nowhere. So I have a virtual tour on the next slide here that you can take a look at, and you can see how it's just wide open, barren area. And then this concept of ex parte endo, the U.S. government could not continue to detain a citizen who was conceitedly loyal to the United States. And that's why we're going to see, and it's a fairly sizable amount of Japanese Americans who will join the U.S. military. And in the Army, they will form what's known as the Nisei regiments, and they will fight, but not against Japan, because the United States government was so concerned that they might, accidentally join the Japanese or be mistaken for Japanese soldiers in the war, that they were only sent to fight against the Germans. So they went to the European front, not to the Pacific front. This is a Japanese American store. They're advertising, "I'm an American." You can see examples there of the different families. They're getting ready to go, being relocated, packing up their stuff. Again, wanting to try to stay, but that wasn't going to be a possibility. Many of them are going to actually lose their businesses, and they really don't get an official apology from the U.S. government until the Bill Clinton administration. And there's very little payment back to them for what they lost. All right, here's the VR tour. So if you go into the the near pod, as you're going through this on your own, you can feel free to kind of scroll around, but this gives you a pretty good idea that it's literally out in the middle of nowhere. All right, you can see examples, kind of what the buildings would have looked like out there during the time. And it's a fence surrounded them, and it had barbed wire on it, so this wasn't exactly a vacation for them. All right, government and politics, expansion of government power. New Deal programs were partially eliminated. That's obvious because they didn't need to employ people anymore, especially the WPA and the CCC. Those people were all in the military now. We see a vast expansion of the power for the federal government, which often happens during times of war. Election of 1944, FDR ran for an unprecedented fourth term. He wins primarily because the war is going very well at the time. Americans have shown time and time again that they don't like to change in a time of crisis. So the reality of it is, in 44, things were going good. Nobody wanted to make the change. War is still going on. So they kind of stick with FDR. And obviously, after this, people are going to realize that he probably had too much power, and there'll be a change made to the Constitution so that you can only serve 2 terms. Thomas Dewey was a Republican governor of New York. He's one of his biggest competitors. Government control over people's lives, and again, the vast expansion of power of the federal government was certainly an issue, and that's what the Republicans were running on against FDR. Truman will be his vice president, and FDR will pass away shortly after his 4th election, and Truman will serve most of his term, and then Truman will run against Dewey in 48 and narrowly defeat Dewey. Okay, here is your open-ended question and the end of your day 3 presentation.